This is ASMA's podcast, an audio production from the American Society for Muslims in Architecture. Assalamu alaikum and welcome along. We've had this idea at the back of our minds for a while, and alhamdulillah, we're able to bring you at least the first iteration of it, thanks to Ismael Gad, one of our two speakers in this episode, who pitched us the idea for it. As a landscape architecture student at The Ohio State University, he and his colleague Maira Hafeez have an interesting common background that played a rather unexpected role in their pursuits. I was joined by them to discuss landscape architecture, its role in the built environment, and how their disciplinary, cultural, and even family backgrounds have impacted them as they navigate their academic journey with influence and perspective from our shared faith. Ismail is a graduate student with a background in civil engineering and experience in stormwater infrastructure solutions. Passionate about designing functional and sustainable outdoor spaces, he blends engineering expertise with creative design to create meaningful environments. Maira is an undergraduate student with a background in fine and visual arts and a passion for nature and design. She fits practicality and sustainability with aesthetics into her designs to make intentional and relevant spaces that can benefit everyone and everything that interacts with them. Currently, she is in a full-time co-op position at a landscape architecture firm and is really enjoying it. Speaking of which, I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion and we hope you do as well, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So, Ismail, you're the son of two parents in the medical field, right? And
one parent, really.
One of them, okay.
Yeah, but it's a family that is just, immersed in medicine. Like my siblings are in medicine, and my dad and his dad, my grandfather, were also into medicine. And I think Myra's kind of speaking about it earlier, how like a lot of people from our city in Toledo, it's like there's a culture of medicine where. Right. And I'm sure it's the same because I feel like when I visited other cities across the country, a lot of Muslim communities, they're putting their kids or kids are choosing to be pre-med and on this conveyor belt of becoming medical professionals. And it's even beyond just like doctors. It's like physician assistants, nurses. There's an attraction to be near the hospital and be in medical care. I'm sure there's lots of trends. There's a lot of reasons for why that's the case. But I think it's interesting how some of us, and especially people that I've been meeting in Columbus and running into through ASMA, how there's a group of people who've kind of chosen a different trajectory in the future. And I think that's kind of why I think it's important for us to kind of discuss it and kind of examine that further and why that's the case and what's the motives behind that.
Which is why really you had the idea to discuss this. And Maira, in just a little bit ago, you were just saying that you had a similar conversation with Ismail at the Ohio State University, and you're on a project together, and you kind of kept sidetracking, just talking about this for like a couple of hours. And I imagine it's because two Muslim students in a landscape architecture degree at the same time is a rarity.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's super rare because like even when you talk to most Muslims who don't choose medicine, it's usually going to be in business. It's going to be in tech or computer science. So when you kind of have this like really long major, like landscape architecture, people are like, oh, wow, like what's that? Or like they kind of can understand wrap their head around it, but they're also like a bit confused by like, why don't you just do regular architecture? Why you have to be so special and pick landscape as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I wonder how you describe landscape architecture in Egypt, because in Egypt there's no defined term for that, I think.
I haven't found a good word. The closest Arabic word I found is like mashhad. Yani ma'mari.
Like a scene?
Yeah, like because scenery, like that's the closest thing I could think of. But even then, I'm not really sure what's the formal professional term for it.
I guess the closest thing I found, I researched it actually, and by research that I looked for one term in one college or university, and it was Ain Shams University. They describe it as هندسة المناظر الطبيعية, which is the engineering of natural scapes. It's a really weird term for a country that I feel like should really be more focused on landscape architecture a lot more than that. It's so weird because we're what, 5% vegetated land, 95% desert, something along those lines, and the vegetated land being like deserted now. Anyway, don't want to get sidetracked here, but because we're both Egyptians, it was a really kind of interesting thing to bring up, and you're the first Egyptian I've ever seen studying landscape architecture. But Myra, I guess I wanted to ask you, what kind of motivated you at the start to study landscape architecture? You, of course, also being from a family that's mostly in the medical field.
So my parents are both doctors, and my dad has always been very creative. So he got me into art when I was young. So
Oh, that's
going to
great.
college, I was
Mm.
pre-med for like a month, and then I wasn't really I wasn't really pre-med. I just did it because I didn't want to be like a undecided major.
Yeah.
But I changed to pre-architecture. And I had always heard negative things about architecture. Always, always, always. I have a cousin who's an architect. She hates it. Um, and I didn't know that landscape architecture even existed. So when I
Mm.
applied to the architecture school, they had us pick whether or not we wanted to be deferred into the landscape school if we didn't get in. And I
Okay.
was. And at first, when I found out that I didn't get into architecture and I got into landscape, I was upset because I didn't know anything about landscape. Not only being from a family of doctors, but like I don't think our society even talks about it. I had never heard of it before. I chose it anyways because I was like, I can get an architecture degree after. And now I'm very, very, very happy that I'm in landscape. I think I would be
Mm.
very sad if I was in architecture. Um,
Why is
especially
that?
like, well, I like that I get to do good, like I'm not building an apartment complex or like a single family housing or something
I
that
guess so. Yeah. Yeah.
um I guess I just like that I can restore nature. And I was talking about it with my dad because I've always been interested in Islamic architecture. And I realized with landscape, I don't know, like gardens and nature is all very important in Islam. And I mean, I'm doing good because I'm helping the earth. We're restoring these places, we're helping people get outside. And people don't realize how much they need this until it's gone. So,
Yeah,
That's really interesting.
I
yeah.
would dovetail it as well. I think like architecture in particular from like the Western point of view has orientalized Islamic architecture, where there's a heavy emphasis on the dome or the minaret or
That's very
Mhm.
true.
the intricate patterns. And Muslims, and especially like you mentioned how Egypt's 95% desert, but a lot of where Islam spread are in places where there isn't always a whole lot of greenery. But that doesn't mean that Muslims are like desert creators. Like I think like the Zionist narrative that's typically pushed is like, oh, these Arabs, they create deserts, and us Israelis with our superior technology know how to make the desert bloom. And I think that's actually quite the opposite. I think because Arabs have they have such a limited amount of water and it's such a limited amount of greenery that they take extra good care of what exists and what's left, right? Which is why there's
Yeah.
all these old technologies which preserve water, which protect it. And Muslims have created amazing gardens, which are now being, discovered and being like, oh yeah, like Persians were really the first like landscape architects, and any knowledge that we actually learned about landscaping, we really picked it up from Muslims and we picked it up from Arabs. And I'm really interested in Diana
Mm.
Dark these days, and I really hope maybe in a future episode, Esma can do an interview with her. Um,
Mm.
is she kind of brings to attention how a lot of European architecture borrowed from Muslim architects. Now, the one gap that I see now that I've kind of picked up her books is what about landscape architecture, right? And I think
Yeah.
landscape is such a universal language that it allows us to connect across many different cultures, because horticulture, botany, these plants, these vegetation, you can pick them up and bring them to new locations, try them out, blend them, hybrid them. That aesthetic can translate into new places and spread. Um, so I'm really curious if Diana Dark will kind of build, write a future book about landscape architecture, since she's covered architecture extensively. Um,
Hmm.
but I think to kind of bring this back to like the original topic about like medicine and why there's a shift or transition away from medicine and towards something like gardens, is I think at the core of both professions, at medicine or landscape architecture or architecture engineering broadly, whatever profession you pick, there is a care and concern for humans, right? And it's really just dependent on what is the scale that you want to treat and take care of humans. So like obviously if you're a doctor, you have the responsibility of assessing a patient and diagnosing him and giving him the proper treatment. But that happens on a patient by patient level. Now there's definitely like research which farms all the data from doctors and tries to find trends and tries to find reasons in terms of why there's certain diseases that are spreading. But for something like landscape architecture, which obviously can be said about other professions, but I think it's especially true about landscape, is you're looking at the land from a much broader and wider lens. And that encompasses a lot more people, right? You're no longer focusing on one individual at a moment, but you're looking things at a larger scale. And for me, that was a huge turning point in my career. And it's ironic, we're having this conversation while I'm here in Egypt, but when I was in Egypt 3 years ago, right before I started my master's program, I was visiting Al Azhar Park among other landscape architecture projects, and I could start seeing that transformative shift that was changing Egypt, right, where there has been such a strong emphasis on modernization, which obviously requires heavy urbanization. You're starting to see the pendulum swing in the opposite direction, where people are now saying, well, what about the landscape? What about the trees? Don't we deserve places for shade? Don't we need places, public spaces that can get us away from all the pollution and the stress and the heat? And that's when I came to a realization that if I really wanted to push a narrative and push change, maybe not even just in Egypt, but in other places as well, we need to start studying it with this science and with this knowledge of landscape architecture.
Yeah, I mean, we were mentioning just a little bit ago that there's no real term for landscape architecture in Egypt. And I don't imagine, because there's no term for it in Arabic, that there is a specific term for it in other Arab countries in the Middle East or other Muslim majority countries. And that's a problem, is that it's kind of been completely fallen by the wayside in the
Maira, I'm
practice of
curious.
kind of
Yeah.
urbanism. And I wanted to ask Myra about the kind of the same question, kind of
Urdu,
in your
yeah.
hometown. Yeah.
If you have an Urdu, is there something similar
I
to?
don't think so. There's a huge need for landscape architects in Pakistan. People there don't even know what that is, but so I don't think there's a term for it.
Wow,
I think the
Mhm.
closest term would be landscaper, unfortunately.
Yeah.
interesting.
And landscaper is kind of a way to stigmatize landscape architects in the United States. So
It's typically used
we
in a
keep kind of the same thing.
derogatory. It's like if you
Yeah,
Yeah.
tell in Arabic,
it
if you
does
say someone,
offend me quite a bit when someone says
yeah,
like, "Oh,
You're
you
a
can
gardener.
landscape my like front yard or something." Like,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
sure.
come mulcha, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's also kind of influenced by the American dream home sort of imagery that's in the American culture. Um, but
Well,
what I'm saying is
that's yeah.
there's no the practice of landscape architecture has fallen by the side in urbanism across our cultures. So I guess, is that kind of the motivation? You've brought it up pretty early on in this episode. Is that kind of the motivation to kind of bring back that importance to landscape architecture in those areas?
I picked up a book from the library recently about Islamic gardens and architecture, and I'm saying this because it's shocking that there isn't a word for Islamic architecture in Pakistan, because there's huge sections in this book that are talking about landscape architecture. It's talking about Babur and the Mughal emperor
Hmm.
who
Yeah.
created hundreds of gardens across the Indus Valley.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have this like, strong tradition of creating ecosystems and lush gardens, and there isn't a definitive profession. I'm not sure if it's so much a problem within our cultures. Maybe it's something to say about, has something more to say about Western culture, how they had to create a profession to address the landscape, versus
Yeah.
landscape knowledge and design emerged locally and through traditions in a way that was much more organic, that it didn't have to feel forced, right? That it had to be superimposed on the architecture, because that's what landscape architecture is. Landscape architecture was born from architecture. Like architecture had always existed in Western societies, and it only came later along that they're
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, Frank, what's his name, Frederick Olmsted had to say like, well,
Yeah.
let's canonize this knowledge of landscape, and make it something that you have to get licensed for, and make it a requirement in city contracts and any kind of work that would happen across the city to curb the problem of urbanization and other forms of development. So I think it's maybe actually not so much a critique of our Middle Eastern or Far Eastern civilizations, but maybe something more to say about Western civilization and the assault that it has waged on the land and on the earth, that now there has to be a body of professionals who are working around the clock. And it's very sad. Like, we were talking about the fact that like people use derogatory terms for landscape architects. I think there's a reason for that. I don't think it's not just like, oh, people are, being silly or they're making a mistake. It's that our culture is naturally brutal, right? Western American culture has even coined the term of brutalist architecture, right? And when everything is so brutal and you try to introduce a profession to soften that development, the reaction is not going to be positive, because people want to return to that brutal nature.
I think also with America is a capitalistic society. Everyone cares about themselves. And I think with our current political climate, doing something that benefits everyone is not what is in their interest,
Correct.
I don't think they like the fact that this is good for society. I think they want to keep it for themselves, which is why people wealthy people hire landscapers. And I don't know. I think it's a really weird, I've never liked the way that Western society approaches work and viewing society as a whole. Even like therapy, for example, like everything about it doesn't fit with at least what I grew up with. And it's really sad because those influences are now going to Pakistan a little bit and, to our countries. And this is not it's not what it's best for us, but this is what they have so much power. They're trying to tell us that, and they're trying to force us to live this certain way. And it's really harming everyone. I really believe that.
Those same exact thoughts were running through my head. I was driving earlier today through Egypt, and it's just all the billboards of people trying to sell you things, artists and famous people, musicians, selling cell phones, food, like real estate, you name it, and
dentist offices.
And put all these people on a conveyor belt of nonstop work, minimum wages, and just putting people on a hamster wheel at the end of the day. And that's and I think that's the incentive behind moving away from a practice such as medicine, where you treat people on a one-on-one individual basis, to start trying to look at a bigger picture, right? Trying to get a more accurate understanding of, I'm sure you guys have heard like the metaphor before. If like you touch an elephant's tail, you'll think it's a rope. If you touch its leg, you're going to think it's a trunk. Versus if you kind of really step back and you open your eyes and you see the whole thing, you'll recognize that it's an elephant. I think that's what landscape is. Landscape really tries to broaden and stretch the domain of thinking about a piece of land or an environment or a context or a site that isn't so limited in scope. I think for me, especially as coming from an engineering background, where engineers have had to, in order to address problems, become more and more and more specific about specific problems and get very to the nitty-gritty details of all the variables in a specific problem. And that's why we have an abundance of equations, that you only solve like one equation or a few equations at a time in order to really isolate the variables and understand it and be able to solve it accurately. And I think landscape kind of loosens up that strictness or that rigidness or the narrow-mindedness when looking at the environment that I think is necessary. And I think, not to, really boost the landscape architecture, for lack of better words, but I think when landscape architects are given enough room to communicate the value and the need of ecologies, and we start taking it really seriously, right? Not just like from a perspective of like, well, just put some trees here, right? Or this project needs some trees. Let's slap on some trees on the site. No, but we really take it seriously, and we say, what is the social responses? What's the social behavior or the behavioral responses of our interventions on the landscape? right? Not just as landscape architects posing that question, but engineers and architects as well. I think could really
Yeah.
soften the way our built environment could and should look like.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's so important to recognize that I like siloing landscape architecture, as y'all mentioned before, that kind of canonization of landscape as its kind of its own thing, and canonization of architecture as its own thing, and canonization of engineering as its own thing. They're all connected in a really meaningful way. And that's something to me that's been really frustrating about practicing architecture is that I'm in an architecture firm. We're only doing architecture. We have to get somebody else from the outside to address the exact same project, the exact same goals, but that's the landscape architecture part of it, the kind of working apart from us. Whereas having those collective discussions as one interdisciplinary model of practice is gonna be so much more beneficial to the world than us doing our own thing and you doing your own thing. Um, and the other really frustrating thing that kind of ties into it, as someone who's studied and has been practicing architecture, is that we contribute so much to the harm that's being forced onto the world. Quick pause to let you know that if you shop books online at Edinburgh University Press, you can get 30% off your order by applying the promo code ASMA30. That's ASMA30, all caps, all one word. Visit the link in the description and be sure to apply the promo code at checkout. Again, that's ASMA30 to get 30% off your order when you shop books online at Edinburgh University Press.
I think landscape architects, like we're not like our hands are still red, right? Like I think there's still a lot of collective harm that is done by all professions, right? And like it may
Yeah.
be some more than others, but I think really engineers are the ones who've have a huge grip on the built environment as of now, because our dominant epistemology, or the way that we look at the world right now, is through this heavy post-enlightenment way of thinking, right? Where everything has to be rationally reduced to numbers and data and
Yeah, yeah,
science.
yeah.
And that's not the case, right? I mean, we have Maira on the call here. Like, but I mean, even as Arabs, right, we have rich cultures of poetry, right? Rich cultures of poetry that don't necessarily fit squarely within an enlightenment paradigm that you can always rationalize the unseen, or rationalize uh, uh, the emotional, the sensitive parts of the human existence, right? And I think
Yeah.
the landscape architect almost forces us or corners us to kind of address that reality, because when you're in such close proximity to ecology and plants and stuff, it naturally sparks something. And obviously, from a Muslim standpoint, we call it the fitra, but it ignites something within our souls that tells us that there is something deeper here, right? There's something more
Yeah.
to my existence than being trapped within four walls and a ceiling, and feeling that you're boxed in an apartment space and you're just supposed to go back and forth between work. But sometimes we need the spontaneous, sometimes we need the frivolous to enter into our lives, and we have to really start elevating that. And I think when we start to undo this enlightenment thinking, we're going to see that rhetoric that is like demeaning or derogatory towards a landscape slowly kind of roll back, hopefully, inshallah. um,
Inshallah.
I'll get off
Beautifully
my
put.
I'll get off my pulpit, but I see that in Myra's work in landscape, and I think architects, they still have an ability kind of to grasp what landscape architects are talking about. And I think maybe the role of architects in all of this is, how can they be translators to engineers and other professions who maybe are not as close to landscape architects, to help communicate that message to other professions that are maybe not as rigorously trained in these sciences or in this knowledge.
I actually disagree on that a little bit.
Go ahead.
I think architects don't understand what we do. I think engineers, environmental engineers, civil engineers, they all understand much more. I think because we work for the city and we have to do things that, people are going to use daily. At least in my experience, every at least architecture major at OSU kind of looks down on the landscape kids, to be honest.
Hmm.
They have said things, they have done things, they've destroyed models. And I
Well,
think
that's awful.
it is awful. And I really do think that architects do have a little bit of a pretentious vibe to them. And they do think that they're better than landscape architects. I really do
I
feel
don't
like,
know. I don't know because it. I studied architecture at UVA, and I'm not gonna try to put UVA on a pedestal here, but I felt like UVA, the interdisciplinarity of how its curriculum works, we've interfaced a lot with landscape architects, and we've learned a lot from each other in the same discussions and actually the same seminars and the same studios. And to me, I feel like it's a matter of school culture and the way that leadership fosters these relationships between different disciplines rather than the entirety of a discipline viewing another as something. I could partly agree that we don't understand what landscape architects do enough. But I also think it's the way that architects in OSU going to destroy models and stuff. I've never seen anything like that happen, to be honest. And speaking as an architect, not only do I want to kind of clarify that, but also I'm really interested in viewing that perspective of your experience. Just because, again, we need to rely on each other and kind of coalesce
mhm.
our discussions and our work. So it's really interesting that you
I
bring it
think,
up, but I don't think it's kind of a general sort of
yeah, it's
viewpoint.
possible it's not general. I think Knowlton is still one of the top schools like in the country when it comes to architecture, right?
Yeah.
And its building draws a lot of attention. Its program is not just a small player in the field of architecture here in the U.S. I will have to agree on some points. I won't agree fully with Myra on some things. I think there
Hmm.
is some interdisciplinary tension between the professions within Knowlton
Definitely.
that right now they're recruiting a new director who is hopefully going to try to lead a more interdisciplinary culture within our school. However, there is some truth that there is a sense of pride and prestige that architects have tried to hold on to, despite the waning or the sunsetting of the profession, with people constantly trying to automate and cut corners, in my opinion, of what architecture should be. Right.
Yeah. AI our way
And
through the profession.
right, AI through our way to the profession, but even way before AI, with engineers
Yeah, yeah.
constantly trying to systemize buildings. And this is where I agree with Myra. I think environmental engineers or hydrological engineers may have a easier time grasping the importance of landscape architects. I will say that the stock civil engineer, the structural engineer, um, has dominated the built environment, and
Mm.
they've eclipsed a lot of the work that architects had the freedom to design and think and do. They have kind of paved over uh, the the architecture that we kind of look in the classical world or the old world. Um, they've kind of taken that over and made things so economically. They value engineered everything that it's become so pale and dry and boring. And it's almost just like when you have like too angry, or you have a parent who has a bad day at work and he lashes it out on the kids and and the wife. That's kind of what I think is happening
Right.
with the architects when they come to the architecture building at Knowlton. They're like, oh man,
Yeah.
like we can't dream up with all the cool stuff that we want to because these damn engineers. And what do? They take it on the landscape architects, and the landscape
Yeah.
architects are like, we thought we were on the same team here. Like, what happened? So
Right.
that might be a bit of a crude
Yeah.
example, but I think there is territories out there in the world, in the professions. Sometimes it's manufactured in an architecture building. People, they exaggerate those differences and those tensions. I think those professions do they work together. Um, but yeah, I think there's a lot of good change that is underway, that could happen soon,
Yeah.
with these professions, especially with the younger, newer generations.
I think that potential for change would be a really big motivator for you for the future. But I wanted to bring it back to what actually motivated you to begin with to study landscape architecture, particularly kind of feeding off of the idea that landscape architects are consistently stigmatized. One of those ways is earning and pay, and that we Arabs, we Muslims should be like the breadwinners of the family, which is valid, of course, and we kind of strive by that. But at the same time, landscape architecture isn't known to be as a field that earns much. I guess that's at least the stigma or the generalized narrative. But did you look at this at all? Did you kind of challenge yourself or have any opposition or sort of tension from within the family when you specifically went from engineering, which is great, to landscape architecture, which is weird to study, before you started your master's program, Ismail?
Well, I think even before engineering, we're talking about medicine. So we're talking about from medicine to engineering to landscape architecture.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
there's so even when you yeah. So I mean, like if you look at wealth just from the perspective of like what's on like Indeed or whatever like job search thing, yeah, you can always compare professions in that way. But you also have to like recognize that when you are receiving that paycheck, like on whose back are you receiving that paycheck? And
Yeah.
moreover, what is the cost of that paycheck? Like going to medical school and becoming a licensed physician is not cheap, right? There's a lot of work that has to be done before you start, getting that paycheck, and that might take a cut on your character, on the way that you are. That I think we should also examine, right? Like in terms of what it truly is wealth. Are we just looking at wealth just through dollars, or can we
Hmm.
broaden the scope of what truly is, um, what makes you a wealthy and healthy individual?
Yeah.
Um,
And unaccomplished, both from a
yeah,
worldly
and from an
perspective and also kind
accomplished
of your
perspective, yeah,
motivation. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I think you get pushed out obviously if you're not like driving the latest like vehicle or living in a big home and stuff like that. You get pushed out of like a social or economic circle. And for me, that was like perfectly okay because not everything about doctors that I saw growing up was something that I aspired to be or to become. Right. I mean, when we talk about the politics within the Muslim community, um, our Muslim community is largely defined by physicians and by doctors, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about the problems within our communities, you're talking about people who've acquired skills and acquired habits and behaviors from a certain kind of educational track and place that they then implement those behaviors and those actions into their community. So you can examine that as well and draw the sources of our community's problems to maybe not having enough of a diverse workforce within our community. That if we did have
Mhm.
more diverse minds and people who bring new ideas and perspectives and were respected, there
Yeah.
we could have maybe a different output of what that community should and could be like. But for me personally, like I never really looked at the dollar sign as something. I've kind of always had the belief that whatever wealth I would acquire in my life was already predestined, and no matter how hard or the outcome of that was not contingent on my profession. And really, what's
Yeah.
on me is to do my work with excellence and to continue to pursue knowledge and serve people as much as possible. And from there, inshallah, Allah will give me the wealth that He had written for me.
Inshallah ta'ala. What about you, Myra? Do you kind of highlight more of what specifically sort of motivates you to not just pursue landscape architecture, but be a landscape architect and enacting change in the world, particularly in the context that we discussed before, that not enough of the world knows about what even landscape architecture is.
I think landscape architects, a lot of the people don't really realize what they're doing, and I think it's really nice to be on a project like, say, building a park for a community that doesn't have access to it. They might not know who I am, but they're gonna really appreciate what I did, and I'm fine with that. I don't need to have a super personal relationship with everyone to make them feel better because what my parents always say about medicine is that it's a noble profession. You help people. And I think what my parents, at least my dad, has realized now, along with me, is that landscape architecture also helps people, but it helps a lot of people, usually, as long as you're not gentrifying spaces. But for the most part, I just really like the fact that can still make a change and I can still better society. And, I can do it at a larger scale, I can do it at a smaller scale. I just really appreciate that I can do that for the earth and for society. And I love nature. I love parks. I love everything about it. Every time I go to a city that has a lack of parks and nature, I've talked to people and they complain about it. They say they wish they had more natural beauty. It's really important to us, our mental health, our physical health, everything about it. So I would love to
Yeah.
just, you know, do that.
So, Myra, you reminded me. I mean, I think a big portion of shifting away from medicine is when you recognize the exploitive nature of medicine, right? That you see people who are drowning in bills, people who aren't able to receive the care that they need, and not even just that. I recently came back from Indonesia not too long ago, but how the way that medicine is thought of is something through it's thought of through something called the Hippocratic Oath, right? And the Hippocratic Oath like gives doctors this sense of duty and responsibility of healing people, right? And if you actually look at like the Far East, right, not just Indonesia, but like all across Asia, their traditional form of medicine doesn't have something like the Hippocratic Oath, like Western medicine has, and it's a much more holistic and it's a much more gentler. And some people will argue it's a pseudoscience, right? That there isn't, it's not as rigorous as brain surgery or heart surgery or the pharmaceuticals that we develop, right? But people understand that taking care of your body is more than just inputs and outputs. It's not just a math problem that you have to solve, right? But there's something about the aura that you bring into a space, the way that you make someone feel, right? And now they're coming out with science and saying, yeah, if you're in a room with bright LED lights, then that might have a negative impact on your mental health versus being in a room with a bunch of lit candles. But once again, it's like the exploitive nature of medicine and how heavily it's monetized and how the science has become used to almost ruin people's lives after they've quote unquote received their care, has also kind of deterred me from wanting to, follow into that path or continue in those
Yeah.
footsteps.
Also, a big trend now is preventative care. You see, insurance companies are,
Yep.
they're trying to look better. They're trying to say, oh, we'll cover gym memberships and all that. But my brother, he's in medical school right now, and he wants to do preventative care because he, our healthcare system is terrible. It really does exploit people. It's not fair to people mentally, physically. And this, introducing these natural yet built environments into cities is one of the best ways to prevent most illnesses. You can prevent physical ones and mental ones. It will improve the quality of life.
All the big, all the kind of breakthroughs that have happened within landscape architecture, or like the recognition that we need more landscape architecture, like when there was cholera that was spreading in cities, right?
Yeah.
There is now recognition that we need to start taking care of our water sources and our water, and all these water environmental laws come into effect after there was huge public health hazards that have kind of went about.
Just another quick pause here to ask you a favor. ASMA is a volunteer-run nonprofit organization that aims to unite, empower, and advocate for Muslims in the field of architecture. That would be impossible without the selfless contributions of so many so far, and we need your help to keep advancing this community. Whether you contribute your money, time, or effort, you can make a big difference. Please consider donating by visiting the link in the description. Jazakumullahu khair. With my work with the American Society for Muslims in Architecture, kind of recognized through not just the participation in the following, but also through like the events that we organize and the number of attendees and their age group, is that it's a really young core. A lot of us are students. A lot of Muslim folks in any design profession are young, emerging designers. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little more or give a bit of advice to younger Muslims who are pursuing landscape architecture, given everything that we said about its importance to the world and to our communities. but also the way that it's stigmatized and how to navigate that and be motivated to pursue it.
I would say two parts whenever you're choosing or thinking about choosing a profession: the actual work that you'll be doing and the impact that work will have on your mind, body, and soul, right? So choose a profession, obviously, that you feel competent enough that you think that you'll be good at when you actually go out to your job and having to serve people. But also think about when you finish or you clock out or when you close your laptop at the end of the day, what will that energy that you've kind of accumulated from work, what will that do to your community, to your loved ones, and those people around you? If you want to be working out an environment, you want to be thinking about our landscapes and plants and public spaces, and if that you find that attractive thing to be working on, um, then great, right? And also think about what that will do, just being around plants and flowers and birds and just being outdoors, what that can do to the people that are closest to you as well. I think in my mind, like there isn't a better profession to pursue than landscape architecture. And I will definitely encourage anyone who's slightly interested to go and join me on that path. But then again, like ride your own tiger. It's not to dismantle or
Yeah.
disparage anybody who's choosing to do medicine. There's great motivations and great reasons to be in the medical workforce. But counterbalance it by what you see, what's actually in practice, and what's actually being produced at the end of the day from these not just academic institutions but professional organizations, and then weigh your judgment in whether or not you think the outcome or the trajectory of these professions is on a positive path.
And to note quickly, I think it's the problem with the system, not the problem with the profession itself. I think any profession
Absolutely.
that serves humanity is a noble one. It's only a matter of how it applies to the economic system that we live in.
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So Myra, same question. What advice would you give?
Um, I think stick with it. You know, if you're Muslim or wherever you're from, I think about where you're from, your background, and how it can apply to that. Um, I don't give up because, family and parents and everyone are saying no. Because, like I don't think my parents don't really like the fact that I'm doing design, They want to say that
Mm.
I'm architectural engineer. They don't want to say that I'm a landscape architectural designer, any of that. But I think you just need to really think about your values, what you want from your life and what you've grown up with. And if it's fitting with that, then just keep going. And if it doesn't, you can make it fit. Or I don't think you should necessarily switch career paths because it's such a broad field. You can do so much with it. You can do so much with this career, which is why it's so hard to define it to people. Because what do
Yeah.
I list off? Do I list off parks? Do I list off like city planning? You can do whatever you want with it. It's just it's what you want to do and what values you believe in, how they align, all of that.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that your parents like to call you landscape engineer, and we could
Hmm.
go on and on with that because we all know how, again, preconceived notions and stigmas about like what a specific career path leads to a specific future outcome, as in doctors or engineers or lawyers or business professionals or IT engineers. Those are the kind of the fields that we perceive as the most rewarding or lucrative or et cetera. Um, and in the Middle East, I mean, Ismail, you would know this. The architecture is actually an engineering discipline, and there's been a big push. I didn't say a big push, but there's certainly been a push recently to recognize it more as a design profession. And I
I'm looking
guess
forward to that day.
to close us off, this has been a really rewarding thing for me. I also come from a background not of a medical of the medical profession like both of you, but my father is a pharmaceutical researcher and educator, and my older brother is certainly on that same career path. I've been the only kid at home to really have this, interest in art and design. Um, and I think the only reason that I was able to strive in my career so far is that I was motivated to pursue it. I was motivated to pursue my own interests rather than kind of siloing potential future career outcomes to engineer, right? And it's been a real blessing, and I would really hope that there's a shift in that thinking of it's not just about individual outcomes, but how can you affect change in the world, and how rewarding is it to work in a field that you really love and appreciate and enjoy and feel like you're making a difference and you're making it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in closing, I think we should all renew our intentions behind what we pursue and what we do for our future. And inshallah ta'ala that would be the way forward
Inshallah.
for our ummah, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah.
Thank you so
Kareem,
much
so
for
much.
joining me.
Yeah. No, thank you,
Yeah, of
Kareem,
course.
for having us. Inshallah, the audience finds some value in our words.
Inshallah, yeah, inshallah ta'ala. And this has been a pilot episode, meaning that we don't know what the future for this production holds, but inshallah ta'ala, we're envisioning a lot to do with it. Hopefully, in the future, we're able to bring you more knowledge and able
Great.
to get something out of it. Thank you so much.
Thank
سبحانك
you.
اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله
لا
إلا أنت
إله إلا
أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you for listening. The American Society for Muslims in Architecture is a volunteer-run nonprofit organization with a mission to unite, empower, and advocate for Muslims in the field of architecture and beyond. To learn more, visit asma.archi, that's asma.archi. Stay tuned for more events and products, get involved by joining our online community, and sign up to our monthly newsletter. Please consider donating and volunteering your time and energy to help advance our mission. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.